Greetings and welcome to room 303 and a series of comments on Edith Hamilton's 1942 classic, Mythology. Now, if there's any text that's probably been assigned more often in 303 than this text, I don't know what that would be. Hamilton, born in 1867, dies in 1963, makes her almost 100 years old, which that in and of itself makes her an amazing person. We want to, in this first lecture of 10 lectures on Hamilton's mythology, we want to introduce you to first Edith Hamilton, and then secondly to her project, and be looking at the introductory pages of our classic text. Let's enjoy, I think the way to say this is, let's enjoy celebrating an amazing, what I'm going to call heroine and scholar, author, and really appreciate, before we get into the text itself, some of the remarkable things about this woman. Maybe you don't know a lot about Edith Hamilton. I think you should. So let's play the game. Born in 1867, some basic biographic information for your notes. Born in 1867 in Dresden, Germany, to American parents who were themselves brilliant and kind of homeschooled her in many ways. She grows up, though, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. She is homeschooled in Latin and Greek and French and German. And in many ways, this is kind of the key to the whole trajectory of her life. She ends up at Bryn Mawr College outside of Philadelphia. She graduates with honors, especially studying in Latin and Greek. Then to Germany, where she's the first female student at the University of Munich. And she's told, you can do this as long as you remain invisible, which is a fascinating, way to think, right? And in fact, her sister Alice says that on her first day in class, she's brought up and set on the podium next to the lecturer, facing the class, and is told, so that no one will be contaminated by contact with this woman. So this just tells you the kind of remarkable person that she was right from the start. She returns back to Bryn Mawr School in 1896, where she becomes the head administrator, and there she becomes a great teacher. So let's write that in our notes. The first thing we want to point out is that long before Edith Hamilton was a great writer about Greek and Roman mythology, she was a great teacher, a great lecturer. She's an innovator. For example, there's this great story about how she decides there's a girls' basketball, this is an all-girls school, there's a girls' basketball team at her school. She wants them to compete with other girls' schools, and this is a major problem at the time. It's fascinating. In 1906, she becomes the first headmistress in Bryn Mawr's history, and retires in 1922 at the age of 54. Some bad health, possibly associated with some of her administrative work. For 26 years, though, she worked for the school as a great teacher and administrator. And then she moves to New York in 1924, where there she begins her writing career. She loved the classics. For example, at 91, she said in an interview, quote, "I came to the Greeks early, and I found answers in them. Greece's great men let all their acts turn on the immortality of the soul. We don't really act as if we believe in the soul's immortality, and that's why we are where we are today," end quote. Well, at a suggestion from a publisher, she starts writing, and she becomes America's most important classicist of her time, some have argued. Barbara Shipman has said, her biographer, that Hamilton's life was, quote, "ruled by a passionately nonconformist vision," end quote. Think here about Emerson's view in Self-Reliance. He who would be a man must be a nonconformist. Let's just put this in our notes. This amazing mind that we will be working with Edith Hamilton was always defining her life through nonconformity. She never claimed to be a scholar. She wanted to be read. She wanted to be a popularizer, we might say. In this regards, we put her kind of in that camp with Will Durant, the great American historian, who we've commented about before in his classic Story of Philosophy, and then, of course, his 11-volume set, Story of Civilization, as well. At 62, finally at 62, think about this. When most people are thinking about winding down their life, this woman decides at 62 in 1930 to write what many have argued might be her most important book, The Greek Way. It becomes an instant bestseller. Here she's contrasting modern culture to ancient Greece. In 1932, she writes a follow-up called The Roman Way. She does something very similar with Roman thought, Rome versus present day. She does admit, by the way, in The Roman Way, that we can't go back to a simpler time. That study of the ancient Greeks and Romans and their ideas, it's important, but we can't go back to live that simpler time because we live in a modern world. In 1932, she was saying. In 1936, she publishes The Prophets of Israel. This is a lesser-known text, but it's her views on the Bible, and it's a fascinating study. And then finally, in 1940, 41, 42, depending on the copyright dates that you're looking at, our text, Mythology. And this one becomes also a major bestseller. This is her best, without question. This is her best storytelling. And many have argued that it's even better than the classic Bulfinch's Mythology. I'm going to leave that one to you to debate whether you like Hamilton or Bulfinch. And then finally she dies in Washington, D.C., May 31, 1963, 95, almost 96 years old. Amazing. Well, now let's turn to the text itself, and let's look at its table of contents. And let's outline now our coming lectures, starting with lecture number 1, the introduction that we're about to do, and then going on. Lecture 2, we're going to talk part 1, chapter 1, and we're going to review the major gods and goddesses. You want to know the names of the different gods and goddesses, both in their Greek and in their Latin derivations. So that way, when we meet them in texts, we feel comfortable. In lecture number 2, we're going to be in part 1, chapter 2, and we're going to talk about 2 great gods of the earth, as she will call it, Demeter and Dionysus or Bacchus. In lecture 4, we're going to go to part 1, chapters 3 and 4, here how the world and mankind was created, as well as some of the earliest heroes. In lecture 5, we're going to be in part 2, which is chapters 5 and 6, Cupid and Psyche here, and then what she calls 8 brief tales of lovers, which will be fun for us. All right, Pyramus, this view will come to mind. In lecture 6, we're going to be in part 2, chapters 7 and 8. Here we're going to be with the quest for the Golden Fleece and Jason. We're going to do the 4 great adventure stories, as she calls them. In lecture 7, we're going to be in part 3. This is chapters 9 through 12. And we're going to hear about the 4 great heroes of Perseus, Theseus, Hercules, and Atlantophile. Lecture 8, you want to circle, because this one is part 4. And if there's any part of Hamilton's mythology that is maybe most referenced, it is probably this part 4, chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. Here, we're going to hear what we call, and what Hamilton calls collectively, the Troy tale. I've used that term before in other lectures. When we talk about the Troy tale, we are talking about this series of stories that are built around 3 dimensions for your notes. Those stories which are pre-Iliadic, they come before the story of the Iliad. Those stories which are the Iliad itself, Homer's first great epic poem. And then those stories that we will qualify, number 3, as post-Iliadic, past the Iliad. And here we're talking primarily about the stories of the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid, among other stories as well. In lecture 9, we'll do part 5, chapters 17 through 19. And here we're going to talk about 3, as she calls them, royal houses. The house of Atreus, the house of Thebes, the house of Athens. And then finally, in our final lecture, lecture number 10, we're going to look at part 6, which is chapters 20, 21. And we're going to look at Midas and a few other brief myths to kind of finish up. Now, let's, for just a moment, talk about our approach and our rationale for our study together. It's possible that you've been following other lectures together with us online at learnstrong.net. And here you can go down that left-hand side and you can see a number of lectures, whether it be the Harvard Classics lectures or other lectures that we've given. And there will be a link there for mythology, and you'll be able to kind of follow these lectures that way. That's how they're archived. But let's talk about the approach, and let's talk about the rationale, and then we'll get into the introductory comments. Our approach, this won't shock you. This will sound very much like anything that we would do in 303. First of all, I'm going to challenge you to read the text on your own and annotate. By annotate, of course, we are talking about our 3 levels of reading. We answered 3 questions. Level 1, what does the text say? Here we're just summarizing. Level 2, what does the text mean? Here we are subdividing at 2A, major themes and messages. At 2B, rhetorical techniques, not what the author says, but how the author says it. And then finally at level 3 we ask, how can I relate this information to stuff I already know? That is to say, we divide level 3 into 2 parts as well. 3A, how can I relate this to other texts that I know, and of course the world around me. And then finally, and most importantly, how can I relate this to myself? Now, why is that important? Because in 303, as you know, we define learning as the capacity to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. And of course, each of us do that in a different way, right? And then after you've done your own annotative work, I recommend that you come back to my lectures and flow my lectures to help kind of maybe fill in some of the gaps. And then finally, I'm going to challenge you to do your own continue research, right? In other words, read the primary text. Think of it this way. Edith Hamilton's Mythology is what we call a secondary text. In other words, there are primary texts, like, for example, Virgil's Aeneid, or Homer's Odyssey, or Homer's Iliad, or whatever. She's going to have read those texts. She's going to be summarizing those texts. That's why we call her texts a secondary text. I'm hoping that your study here will lead you back to those primary texts, and you'll say, you know, I think I want to read Hesiod, or I think I want to read, Sophocles, or I think I want to pick up the Iliad and actually, I've always dreamed of reading the Iliad. Now I feel like I have enough background information to maybe actually pick it up and study it on my own, okay? Now, what's our rationale? Well, I think there's 3 things here that I want you to write down. These will be the focus for us through our lectures. First, and I hope this makes sense to you, because I really mean it. The first focus here is fun. Think of it this way. Edith Hamilton wrote this book because she loved to tell stories. There are no greater stories to be told than the stories of the ancient Greek and Roman mythologies, okay? And so I want us to have a good time enjoying just getting into these stories. Number 2, I think there's a backward-looking, and then number 3, a forward-looking kind of reason to study this text. From the backward-looking perspective, of course, we want to ask it. What did the Greeks and Romans understand about the world, right? Let's say this out loud for your notes. I'll come back to it in a second. It's called mythology, and we normally think of mythology as a term which denotes those stories which are untrue. The Greeks and the Romans didn't call these stories mythology, right? For them, this was their early science. For them, this was their early religion. They didn't see it as mythology. That's what got Socrates in so much trouble. We've given earlier lectures in the Harvard Classics on this, right? That's what got Socrates in so much trouble, because he looked at some of these stories and he said, really? You don't want to imagine that Zeus is running around hanky-pankying all the time. You can't think of that as your chief deity, and I got him in a lot of trouble. Of course, remember, he was, in 399 BCE, accused of what? Atheism and, of course, corruption of the youth because of his atheistic views, right? Finally, at number 3, I think a forward-looking reason to be studying this text is we want to see the influences of Greek and Roman thought in modern and postmodern culture. We've been mentioning, of course, in lots and lots of other lectures, the ideas of the Greeks and Romans. Now it's time for us to take seriously that study. Just to give you just a couple of examples, in 1922, the most important, many argue, the most important novel of the 20th century is published by James Joyce, and it's called Ulysses, a retelling of the story of Homer. Now, the story, of course, of Odysseus or Ulysses assumes a certain kind of understanding of all kinds of stories that come before Odysseus's return to Ithaca. Here again, we'll be studying to kind of pay attention to what all those stories are. Another classic example, if you're into it all, the Star Wars films. Anytime you pick up a Star Wars film and you watch it, you're going to be shocked at the amount of Greek and Roman kinds of intonations that are there. Well, let's turn now to the actual text itself and the introductory comments. Here's where we want to kind of pay attention. Now, if you haven't done this reading, I recommend that you, for a moment, pause and go and do the reading yourself. Do your own annotation and then come back, and we'll spend a few moments now with some of that. Hamilton will open her introduction with a quote from the great Greek historian Herodotus. Of old, The Hellenic age was marked off from the barbarian as more keen-witted and more free from nonsense. Now, of course, we're going to see the irony in an idea like this, because when we look at mythology and all of this kind of stuff in these stories, we're going to go, what kind of nonsense? I mean, are you talking? No. For Herodotus, his argument is that the Greeks were very interested in asking profound questions about existence, and they would often articulate those findings, that science, that new understanding, through their stories. Well, we continue here by making some observations, and because I love to read, Hamilton's prose is great. I'll read a few lines. The prospect, she says, of traveling back to this delighted state of things is held out by nearly every writer who touches upon classical mythology, above all by the poets. In that infinitely remote time, primitive man could, quote, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn, of course, quoting from the great Wordsworth poem, "The world is too much with us late and soon," a text we've already lectured. And to return, and we for a moment can catch, through the myths he made, a glimpse of that strangely and beautifully animated world. Well, it is a beautifully animated world. Right away, under the heading, The Mythologies of the Greeks, Hamilton will get to the most important phrase of the introduction, and it's one I want you to write down in your notes. The Greek miracle. The question, of course, of derivation immediately arises when we study not just Greek and Roman mythology, but of course any mythology. What made peoples decide to tell these stories? Hamilton will call it the Greek miracle. Let's listen to what she says. People often speak of the Greek miracle. What the phrase tries to express is the new birth of the world with the awakening of Greece. Old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new, she quotes from the New Testament. Something like that happened in Greece. Now, why it should happen in Greece continues, of course, to be the subject of all kinds of really interesting questions. She will point out that the Greeks' view of the gods, what we will call anthropomorphic, don't get blown away by that word, anthrop, over related to the human. Morph just simply means to change, right, or form. And so if the gods are anthropomorphic, that means that the Greeks pictured these gods in human form. So when they thought of Apollo, and you can go online, and I'm going to recommend this in my second lecture, for every one of the gods and goddesses, do a Google image search and take a look at the different kinds of representations, from drawings to sculpting and the like. All of them almost always are understood in human form, anthropomorphic. Now, how is this different? I mean, isn't this true for all of the early mythology? No, it's not. Hamilton points out, for example, that the Egyptians didn't play this game at all. Their gods are far more remote gods. That is to say, she will make the argument that one of the things that makes Greek study of Greek gods and goddesses so important is that the Greeks saw these gods and goddesses as more intimate, closer. We'll get to some lines in a second to kind of play that game. She quotes, St. Paul said the invisible must be understood by the visible. That was not a Hebrew idea. It was a Greek idea. In Greece, she says, alone, in the ancient world, people were preoccupied with the visible. They were finding the satisfaction of their desires in what was actually in the world around them. She continues by making the observation that human gods, naturally, she said, made heaven a pleasantly familiar place. The Greeks felt at home in it. They knew just what the divine inhabitants did there, what they ate and drank, and where they banqueted, and how they amused themselves. Of course, they were to be feared. They were very powerful and very dangerous when angry. Still, with proper care, a man can be quite fairly at ease with them. He was even perfectly free to laugh at them, unless of course you're Socrates, who got himself in a bit of trouble there. Zeus, trying to hide his love affairs from his wife and invariably shown up, was a capital figure of fun. The Greeks enjoyed him and liked him all the better for it. Hera was that stock character of comedy, the typical jealous wife, and her ingenious tricks to discomfort her husband and punish her rival, far from displeasing the Greeks, entertained them as much as Hera's modern counterpart does us today. Such stories made for a friendly feeling. Laughter in the presence of an Egyptian sphinx or an Assyrian bird beast was inconceivable, but it was perfectly natural in Olympus, and it made the gods companionable. And I like this word, companionable. In other words, the Greeks could somehow relate better, we might say, with their gods for this very reason. She continues, the terrifying irrational has no place in classical mythology. Magic, so powerful in the world before and after Greece, is almost non-existent, which is fascinating. She continues by pointing out that there's actually only two nasty witches, Circe and Medea, the only witches, and they're young and of surpassing beauty, delightful, not horrible. The priest, she continues, is rarely seen and never of importance hardly at all. Ghosts, too, which have played so large and so fearsome a part in other lands, never appear on earth in any Greek story. The Greeks were not afraid of the dead, the piteous dead, the Odyssey calls them. She says as well that there's a very limited sense of right and wrong which prevails in Homer's heaven and for a long time afterwards. But we do have issues, of course, in regards to human sacrifice. We'll get to that question here in a few moments. She finds she finishes the introduction then this way. She says, Greek mythology is largely made up of stories about gods and goddesses, but it must not be read as a kind of Greek Bible, an account of the Greek religion. According to the most modern idea, a real myth has nothing to do with religion. An explanation, we might say, the way she says it is, it's an explanation of something in nature to explain the unexplainable. How, for instance, any and everything in the universe came into existence. Men, animals, this or that tree or flower, the sun, the moon, the stars, storms, eruptions, earthquakes, all that is and all that has happened. Thunder and lightning are caused when Zeus hurls his thunderbolt. A volcano erupts because a terrible creature is imprisoned in the mountain and every now and then struggles to get free, and on and on and on it goes. The stories, she finishes this paragraph, are early literature as well as early science. She finishes her introduction by pointing out where she got her ideas from. Again, for your notes, this is important. Hamilton is going to provide us a secondary rendering of